Undeclared wars are commonplace. Tragically, our government engages in preemptive war, otherwise known as aggression, with no complaints from the American people. Sadly, we have become accustomed to living with the illegitimate use of force by government. To develop a truly free society, the issue of initiating force must be understood and rejected.
What if sometimes, to love your country, you had to alter or abolish the government? What if Jefferson was right? What if that government is best which governs least? What if it is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong? What if it is better to perish fighting for freedom than to live as a slave? What if freedom's greatest hour of danger is now?
Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Thursday, February 26th, 2026. My dear friend Max Blumenthal joins us now. Max, I want to talk to you about the lies the Israelis have told the president. But before we get there, a couple of other issues. What is your understanding of this incident that happened somewhere between southern Florida and Cuba on a speedboat yesterday involving Cuban intelligence and some, I guess, Americans?
Yeah, this was something that was consistent with the behavior of Cuban exiles in South Florida and Miami going back to the 1970s, where it looks like they staged a terrorist attack on Cuba, attempting to land a speedboat off the city of Santa Clara in Cuba, and then carry out guerrilla-style terrorist attacks inside Cuba to destabilize the country at a point when its population is suffering in unprecedented ways from the oil embargo imposed by Donald Trump, which, according to people I've spoken to on the island and who just came from there, is really causing a humanitarian crisis. So one figure who's associated with this attack is named Amijail Sanchez Gonzalez. And there's a Facebook account associated with Amijail Sanchez, and it shows records of terrorist attacks that have already taken place in recent months in Cuba, including people setting fire to buildings and farmland, agricultural fields. He was one of the figures who was detained on this boat. There's so many points to make here. One point is that the Cuban Coast Guard or Cuban Defense Forces managed to neutralize the attackers on this boat and wounded many others. But unlike the United States, which has been carrying out double tap strikes on fishing boats, ostensibly carrying marijuana and cocaine, they didn't kill everybody gratuitously. They captured many people, including Sanchez Gonzalez, and learned the identities and gave them treatment. So much more humane than the U.S., than the Pentagon has been.
Didn't the people on this boat shoot and injure a Cuban officer on the Cuban military or Coast Guard boat?
The passengers on this boat attacked the Cuban Defense Forces or Cuban Naval Forces first and wounded the commander on a boat before they were all taken out. So this was an attack on Cuba, an attack on Cuban sovereignty. In a press conference today, Secretary of State Marco Rubio was unable to offer a coherent answer on what took place here. He was stuttering. And the question is, what did he know and when did he know it? Because it's very difficult for an American, even with a fast boat, to go disembark from the coast of Florida and get 90 miles through the Caribbean to Cuba without being interdicted by the U.S. Coast Guard. It is illegal to do so from the United States. So how did they get through Coast Guard interdiction and Coast Guard surveillance of that entire highly sensitive area? What did Marco Rubio know? Marco Rubio commands these forces in South Florida in so many ways. This is Marco Rubio's policy of terrorizing Cuba. And as we reported at the Gray Zone, relying on FBI interviews, leaked documents, and our own reporting, there was this other operation known as the Bay of Piglets against Venezuela, we actually interviewed the lead mercenary of this operation, Operation Gideon, in which groups of mercenaries attempted the same thing in Venezuela, to topple the government by landing on a Venezuelan beach. They were caught. Many of them were killed. The rest were captured. This involved U.S. former Green Berets. And, you know, from everything we were able to deduce from these documents, from the interviews with Jordan Goudreau, the mercenary leader, the U.S. intelligence knew all about this plot. And they let it go into action. They did not attempt to stop it in any meaningful way. And that's what it looks like here. And again, the Operation Gideon plot against Venezuela may have failed, but it was a pretext for the U.S. military invasion of Venezuela, which saw the U.S. kidnap Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. And just another point that I think is important here is during the 1970s, something like 40% of all terrorist bombings in the world were being carried out by Cuban exiles from Miami with the support of the CIA. Posada Carriles is one terrorist figure who was groomed in Miami, who bombed Cubana Flight 455 in 1976. Cubana Flight 455 was at the time carrying the North Korean fencing team. 76 passengers were killed. Posada Carriles was a strictly protect figure who was then given sanctuary in Panama for this attack. He was never punished. He died a free man, and his partner in planting the bomb, Orlando Bosch, was celebrated in Florida, in Miami, with an Orlando Bosch Day, which was authorized under the watch of Governor Jeb Bush. Cuban exile terrorists from Miami have killed Cubans while they were on beaches, mowed down Cuban civilians. They have bombed Cuban hotels throughout the 70s and 80s. And anyone who wants to see a very accurate, dramatic rendition of this period in Cuban history should watch the WASP Network, the film about the so-called Cuban Five, who are a network of Cuban spies in the United States who were assigned with the task of breaking down this network of Cuban terrorists, and did a fairly effective job, and then were all arrested and given life sentences and got released as part of a sort of a prisoner swap with the U.S. We actually interviewed one of them at the Gray Zone and have that on our YouTube channel. But now this dark period of CIA-backed terrorism appears to be returning to Cuba under the watch of Marco Rubio.
And now they have their boy in power as the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor.
Exactly.
And probably assumed that he would have their back, and we'll find out once he gives a coherent statement if he has their back. Switching over to the Middle East, has there been any fallout from the nonsense that came out of the mouth of Ambassador Huckabee in the Tucker Carlson interview about Israel is entitled to all the land in the Middle East?
Well, I think we saw the fallout in the form of a Saudi-organized statement of all of the Arab states who are basically vassals and who are expected to play ball with Israel through some form of cold peace, actually protesting Huckabee, declaring that their land, their countries, could be part of Greater Israel according to the Bible. This was an unprecedented statement, and I think it really did complicate the case for war on Iran. Tucker deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. If the Nobel Peace Prize had not been converted into the Nobel War Prize, he would deserve it for his efforts in interrogating not just the crooked U.S. policy being implemented from occupied Jerusalem against Palestinians, but the entire ideology behind it, which is embodied by Mike Huckabee, who is right now the world's most influential Christian Zionist. But that's obviously not enough to stop the war. I think there are two factions within the Trump administration who are jousting right now, almost in public, to either sabotage a potential deal with Iran or to make a deal. And the terms that I'm seeing laid down on the table in Geneva are onerous and absolute deal breakers for any proud sovereign nation.
What are those terms, and what are the two camps? Let me back up a little bit. The Washington Post reported 2 or 3 days ago, so I could stop right there and say that means the CIA wants us to know that General Kane, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told the president, we're not going to be able to achieve your goals. Before the sun came up on the morning of this headline, I think it was Tuesday, the president issued on Truth Social. He didn't say that, don't believe it. The Washington Post piece was very long, very well documented. And if you look at the look on General Kane's face, which we will look at together in a few minutes, when Trump made the only remark that caused the Democrats to applaud him as well as the Republicans, you will see that Kane seemed to be disbelieving what he was hearing. So, do you believe that the military is telling him we can't do it?
Well, obviously, I mean, not Pete Hegseth.
No.
Hegseth
the serious military guys, not Hegseth.
Yeah, I mean, Pete Hegseth might be on sort of a perpetual roid bender, but the serious people inside the Pentagon, for example, in the DIA, might understand that there just aren't enough naval assets to sustain a weeks-long assault on Iran and actually achieve any meaningful goal, regime change, degradation of military assets, without paying a serious price. And General Kane, I mean, he talks to the people in procurement in the Pentagon. That's what he's basing his assessments off of. Will they be able to procure enough Patriot missiles and THAAD missiles to defend Israel alone? No. So that speaks to their opposition, and the fact that someone at a very high level in the Pentagon leaked to not just one, but 3 mainstream outlets, Axios, the Washington Post, and I think the Wall Street Journal, just to illustrate how serious they were about their concern about going into Iran, a war that cannot be won just by kidnapping one leader, and which could drag on for weeks or even months, that the vast majority of Americans are opposed to. Then go ahead.
Here's the core of the president's understanding of why the United States is threatened by Iran. I want you to listen to it. It's the only standing ovation he got that the Democrats cheered as well, because they're bought and paid for by AIPAC and their colleagues as well. And then I'm going to ask you, after we listen to this nonsense, what lies did the Israelis tell Trump? Chris, cut number 13.
They've already developed missiles that can threaten Europe and our bases overseas, and they're working to build missiles that will soon reach the United States of America. After Midnight Hammer, they were warned to make no future attempts to rebuild their weapons program, and in particular, nuclear weapons. Yet they continue. They're starting it all over. We wiped it out, and they want to start all over again, and are at this moment again pursuing their sinister ambitions. We are in negotiations with them. They want to make a deal, but we haven't heard those secret words. We will never have a nuclear weapon. My preference is to solve this problem through diplomacy. But one thing is certain, I will never allow the world's #1 sponsor of terror, which they are by far, to have a nuclear weapon. Can't let that happen.
What lies did Netanyahu and company tell him to get him to say that?
Well, we know what lies they told him. And we know that they told him that Iran is a week away from developing a nuclear weapon. But that's not Netanyahu's main objective here. The no deal faction, which is a vehicle for Israeli influence, is represented by Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham. And they want the focus to not be on Iran's nuclear program, because for Iran, that's not necessarily a red line. That's negotiable. They want the focus to be on Iran's deterrence, its allies, and its ballistic missiles. Because once Iran gives that up, they can be balkanized and dismantled as a nation. And Iran is not going to give that up under any circumstance. That is a red line. So listen to the rhetoric that you've heard since the State of the Union. You can get a sense of how all of that rhetoric, including some of that 2003 WMD style rhetoric, was packed into Trump's speech. All of these different factions had input on the State of the Union, and now you can see them separated out through their own individual statements. Rubio saying there's no, Iran has not actually restarted its nuclear program. We destroyed it all, which, they didn't destroy it all, but Iran is not moving towards a nuclear weapon. There's no evidence of that. Lindsey Graham is saying there's no room for any nuclear negotiation at all, not even the civilian facility in Tehran that was built under the Shah that is just used for medical research. None. And the issue should be ballistic missiles, no nuclear negotiation. Then on the other side, you have J.D. Vance and Steve Witkoff hyping up the threat of Iran's nuclear program, which could be interpreted as them setting the stage for Trump making a dramatic deal that eliminates this threat, but also ends the possibility of war. And so those are the two factions as I see it. And it's the former faction that is clearly a vehicle for Israeli influence. Now, if we look at the terms, as reported by the Wall Street Journal, advanced in Geneva, they're very onerous terms, and they may be a deal breaker that can lead us to war, even though they focus largely, if not exclusively, for now, on the nuclear program. Number one, Iran's being asked to dismantle Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. That is a deal breaker. No sovereign nation would do that. They would certainly submit them to inspection. Number two, they are being asked to transfer all enriched uranium to the United States. That's a deal breaker. They have offered to maintain their uranium in consortium with Arab states inside Iran, states that are U.S. allies, but they're not going to transfer their uranium out. And then, zero enrichment. They're offering near zero enrichment, but then there's another term, minimal sanctions relief. Okay, Iran barely got any sanctions relief from JCPOA, and that's the only reason that they would negotiate over their nuclear program is sanctions relief. If they're not going to get any, then what that signals to them is that they make a deal just to avoid war, but then down the line, the sanctions relief will be contingent on them giving up their ballistic missiles and giving up their regional alliances. So they're ultimately going to have to make a deal on Israel's terms anyway. That's why I think these terms are a non-starter.
They're impossible to comply with. I'm looking at the headlines of today's Financial Times. Iran, tell me what you think or know about this. Iran tempts Trump with, quote, bonanza for U.S. companies in bid to avoid war. Have they offered the United States oil and gas rights?
Sure. This is their idea of the way to Trump's heart is Trump is transactional. And if you actually take the Israelis out of the equation, this is the kind of relationship the U.S. would have had with Iran. This is what Maduro was trying to do with Trump before he was kidnapped. And now it's what Venezuela's remaining Chavista government is doing anyway. Iran would be eager to make deals with the U.S., and it would be very lucrative for the United States and for Trump and his little crony corruption ring if they were to go along with it, but the Israelis won't let them. No matter what kind of deal Trump makes with Iran, if it doesn't result in Iran dismantling its own, essentially surrendering its own deterrent capacity and rendering itself vulnerable to dismantlement, that's something that the Israelis will try to sabotage this deal because it stands in the way of their vision of greater Israel. Iran already, I believe, and Israeli intelligence believes this, so it doesn't matter what I believe. Iran is at parity with Israel militarily. And for Israel, that's unacceptable.
Right. Politico is reporting this morning that the White House wants Israel to go in first in the hopes that Iran will attack American troops and thereby give Trump a pretext for war. So if this is true, the President of the United States of America is willing to use American troops as pawns to die and start a war.
Yeah. I mean, this is scandalous. This should be grounds for impeachment hearings if we actually had a Congress. The Democrats can't even bring themselves to vote on this war to assert congressional authority, although I think that's going to happen, possibly too late. But here you have Trump officials stating that this war is so unpopular among the American public that they want to use Israel to provoke Iran into killing Americans so that Americans will yearn for revenge and support an American attack on Iran. They want to, I mean, this is insane. They want a foreign country to attack another foreign country with Americans being used as a tripwire, getting American service members killed in a war that's for the first foreign country's interest, so that the American public brays for blood. And guess what? I don't think Americans are that stupid at this point. This isn't 2003. They're not going to fall for this. There was no 9/11 cataclysmic and catalyzing event. People's eyes are open here. And this war is going to remain unpopular, particularly if American service members are killed. And Israel will and should be blamed for that.
Right now, there's 5,000 of them on an aircraft carrier.
Yeah.
With no functioning toilets.
Yeah, and it's interesting. They docked in Crete, so they're docking in Greece, and Greek citizens are up in arms. There are street protests, anti-war protests, but former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has come out and named Greece as one of the countries that is central to Israel's force projection in the region. Greece has been basically taken over by Israeli intelligence on so many levels and is now hosting Israeli listening stations, Israeli intelligence bases. They're importing tons of Israeli wares. Then you have the island of Cyprus, which is basically a little Israel right now, where wealthy Israelis hid out during the 12-day war with Iran. They're colonizing Cypriot land. They're buying up Cypriot real estate. They're advancing their interests behind the scenes in Cypriot politics. So the Mediterranean is kind of being colonized as well. And you actually have to look in Turkish media to really understand what's happening in Greece because of the historic enmity between Greece and Turkey over Cyprus.
Here is the Iranian foreign minister with whom you and I have met, who has an excellent understanding on these things. I think you'll agree. He said this yesterday. Chris, cut number 6.
President Trump has always complained about fake news. So I think now it is himself the victim of fake news, unfortunately. We are not developing, long-range missiles, and we have limited the range of our missiles below 2,000 kilometers intentionally by ourselves, because we don't want anyone. We don't want it to be like a global threat. This is only to defend ourselves. Our missiles has, defense nature. They are only to build deterrence and to help us defend ourselves, exactly as they did in the last June's war. We didn't initiate that war. It was Israelis and then Americans. We only defended ourselves. For them, that was an illegal act of aggression. For us, it was legitimate act of self-defense.
The Iranian government actually tell the American military when they felt the need to attack American bases for defensive reasons so that no Americans would be in the way and get hurt?
Absolutely. I mean, the 2018 attack on the Al-Assad air base in Iraq, After Trump, following Netanyahu's orders, assassinated the number 2 most powerful official in Iran, Major General Qasem Soleimani. That was choreographed. Iran did not want massive casualties on that base, even though they could have caused them, because it would have led to massive escalation. Iran has always sought to balance its retaliations against the US and Israel with its desire to avoid massive escalation. And now they've sort of reached a breaking point where escalation can no longer be avoided. And so if there is any attack on Iran, the response will not be choreographed with the United States. It will be an all-out regional war. There's nowhere else to go after this point. This is an existential war. And you listen to the rhetoric from Donald Trump and his henchmen, Marco Rubio, but especially Trump during the State of the Union, when, as you pointed out, Judge, Elizabeth Warren stood and applauded after mostly staying seated throughout the evening. Lots of Democrats applauded. Trump claimed that Iran has missiles that can strike Europe and will eventually be able to strike the United States.
That's Elizabeth Warren inside the circle, leading the cheers on the Democratic side. Go ahead, Max.
So it's just disgraceful. And she's not even a major vehicle for AIPAC donations. She's just a tool. Iran has no need for this to deter attacks. But if you actually listen closely to what they're saying Iran could attack American assets. Well, why are American assets surrounding Iran? It really raises some key questions there. Trump said Iran killed millions of Americans with IEDs in Iraq. Millions of Americans, like 5% of the American population was killed by IEDs in Iraq. Well, what the hell? First of all, millions is ridiculous. What the hell were we doing in Iraq?
Right.
On Iran's border.
And Rubio says the Iranians have weapons that can reach our ships. Duh. What are our ships doing there?
Yeah. Well, just pull the ships back, send them home. Most Americans want that. There's only one country in the world. I've heard John Mearsheimer making this important point. And this is the most important point for Americans to understand. There's only one country in the world whose leadership and population supports a war on Iran, and it's not ours. It's Israel, which also happens to be the only country in the world which has a secret, unmonitored nuclear weapons program with over 250 nuclear warheads. Okay, that's the only country that wants this. The American public doesn't want this. I highly doubt the soldiers on the USS Gerald Ford, who have to go to Greece to be able to do a number 2, want this. So who's guiding this? Israel is guiding U.S. military assets into harm's way. And let's be real, the reason those assets are there, the military bases, the ships, the encirclement of Iran, it's all to provide strategic depth for Israel. As the U.S. taxpayers, we're paying for Israel's strategic depth.
You reminded us a few minutes ago of 2003. I think you'll appreciate the comparison between 2003 and 2026. Chris, cut number 14.
The information that I was being given by the intelligence community hung together. And I spent 4 days and nights out at the CIA going over it and asking every way I could, are you sure of this? You have multiple sources on this. And I got those assurances. They're the same assurances that the intelligence community gave to the president, the same assurances the intelligence community gave to the Congress 4 months earlier. I regret it now because the information was wrong. Of course I do.
Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. If they try to rebuild a nuclear weapon, that causes problems for us. And in fact, we've seen evidence that they have tried to do exactly that.
For months afterward, when we didn't find any weapons of mass destruction, we didn't find the biological vans or any of that, until 6 or 8 months later, the intelligence community still insisted that the items were there, and they weren't.
Well, I reported last year during the 12-day war, or right before the 12-day war was launched by Israel, that Mossad chief David Barnea was briefing and essentially renting out the brain of CIA director John Ratcliffe, who is this unqualified nobody, and that Ratcliffe was briefing Trump delivering Israel's intelligence straight to Trump through these closed briefings controlled by Susie Wiles, the chief of staff, who literally worked for Netanyahu on his re-election campaign in 2020. So that's the dynamic that's still at play. John Ratcliffe briefed the Gang of Eight, including Chuck Schumer and Chris Coons, the ranking Democrats who came out of that briefing and said, this is serious. The president needs to explain this to the American public. In other words, we don't oppose it. This is just a PR problem. And now they're explaining it to the American public, claiming Iran can strike the US possibly with nuclear weapons, and they may have restarted their nuclear program. So it's a remix of the run up to the Iraq War, 2003, but with more potentially devastating consequences. And it's all for Israel, because the only threat there of Iran having a nuclear weapon would be towards Israel, because Israel would then lose its complete military edge over its main rival, which actually is the only nation in the region that meaningfully opposes the occupation of Palestine and speaks up for Palestinians. And so if Iran were to produce a nuclear weapon, successfully test it, Israel would have to begin negotiating with Iran, and that negotiation would include a Palestinian state, ending the occupation of East Jerusalem. This would be devastating for Israel. And I think actually a large part of its population would begin to emigrate elsewhere. And that would be the Ashkenazi elite who form the heart of Israel's defense tech sector. That is its only productive economic sector at this point. They'd all go get easy German citizenship and take advantage of our visa waiver program here in the US. And that would pretty much be a wrap. Iran wouldn't even have to detonate a nuclear bomb.
One more clip to show you at the risk of losing your lunch. Cut number three. They're
trying to achieve intercontinental ballistic missiles. For example, you've seen them try to launch the satellites into space. You've seen them increasing the range of the missiles they have now. And clearly they are headed in the pathway to one day being able to develop weapons that could reach the continental US. They already possess weapons that could reach much of Europe already now as we speak. And the ranges continue to grow every single year exponentially, which is amazing to me for a country that's facing sanctions, whose economy is in tatters, whose people are suffering, and somehow they still find the money to invest in missiles of greater and greater capacity every year. This is an unsustainable threat.
The threat is from Israel, and he ignores it because the American Zionists have created him. He's their creature.
Paul Singer is his pimp, and Marco Rubio has hoed himself out to Israel as Secretary of State, which is why he is focused on the ballistic missile threat of Iran, exaggerating ballistic missile threat because he wants to violate Iran's red lines to prevent a deal that Donald Trump clearly wants. And the deal, as it exists now through negotiations in Geneva, focuses exclusively on Iran's nuclear program. It's sort of shocking to see a Secretary of State actually try to reshape a deal on behalf of a foreign country's interests while there are negotiators in the room negotiating on something else, negotiating on separate issues. It's similar to what John Bolton did when Donald Trump wanted to negotiate an end to the Korean War, an armistice agreement between North and South Korea, and to begin normalizing relations with North Korea. John Bolton just simply came in and used the media to sabotage the deal, leaked on Trump, and antagonized the North Koreans. And Donald Trump, as the president, was just left isolated. So we're seeing Rubio play this same role, along with Lindsey Graham, who's simultaneously enjoying, rounds of golf at Mar-a-Lago. I mean, Trump is a separate issue. Like, where is Trump in all this?
Yeah. Do you see that picture? Is that Mrs. Adelson next to Howard Lutnick?
I wonder if that's an AI image that just sort of accurately articulates the forces that control the White House.
Wow.
I don't know if that's a real image or not.
Wow.
But Miriam Adelson was seated. She was at the Board of Peace meeting in DC, I believe. So she's there.
Yeah. Max, thank you very much. A long and very informative session with you. Deeply appreciated, my dear friend. I know you're very busy. Thank you for accommodating my schedule. All my best to you and your family.
Thanks a lot, Judge. Good seeing you.
Thank you. And coming up shortly, if you're watching us live in 20 minutes, but at 1 o'clock today, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. At 3 o'clock today, Chief Dennis Fritz. What do the enlisted guys and gals feel about invading Iran? That's what we'll ask him. Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.